Right, continuing with lesson 7, our last example was working with multiplying by the conjugate. On this example, we see we have an I in the denominator. We don't want that because it's like having a square root down there. So we don't really have a conjugate per se, unless you think of it this way. Think of I as 0 plus I. So if we change the sign, that's really just 0 minus I, which is negative I. So you can multiply by a negative I, or you can just multiply by I. Either way, you'll get to the same place. So I'm going to do a negative I, just to keep that whole idea of doing a conjugate. All right, so if we distribute on top, we get negative 5I, and then negative I times a negative I is minus I squared. On bottom, I times negative I is another negative I squared. So if we have I squareds, those become negative 1, so this changes to negative I minus a negative 1, so that changes to a plus 1. And negative I squared, again, changes to a positive 1. Or another way of writing this would just be to put the real part first, 1 plus, or actually, I would do 1 minus 5I. Because if you divide this by 1, we get 1. You divide this by 1, we get minus 5I. And that would be our final answer. No i's in the denominator, so no roots in the denominator. All right. Sometimes we'll see higher powers of I, and they're actually really easy to find if you realize what the pattern is. So remember, I is the square root of negative 1. So when we squared it, we said that was negative 1. Now we can use that to kind of simplify these further. So we know I cubed is the same as I squared times I. Because if you add the exponents, 2 plus 1, we get 3. We can replace I squared with a negative, so this is really just negative I. Now let's continue the pattern. If we have I to the 4th, we can write that as I squared times I squared. But we know I squared is just negative 1, so this is just saying negative 1 times negative 1, which is just positive 1. So I to the 4th is 1. I to the 5th. Well, you can write that as I to the 4th times I to the 1. Because 4 plus 1 gives us 5. And we know already I to the 4th. We look up here, that's just 1. So 1 times I, or just I. Keep going. I to the 6th. Well, we know 1 down is I to the 5th, which we already know what I to the 5th is. And I to the 5th times I to the 1. We know 1 plus 5 will give us the 6. I to the 5th we found was just an I. So this is I replacing that times the I we already had. I times I is I squared. But from way back here we know I squared is just negative 1. If we keep going, I to the 7th. So you go down 1, we know what I to the 6th is, and we know what I to the 1 is. So let's replace I to the 6th with what we know it is. I to the 6th is negative 1. So this is just negative 1 times I. Negative 1 times I is negative I. Hopefully you're seeing a pattern by now. Go back one more on I to the 8th. That's the same as I to the 7th times I to the 1. We know I to the 7th is a negative I. We know I to the 1 is just I. So I times I, this is a negative I squared. But I squared is just negative 1, so this is a negative of a negative 1, which is a positive 1. So you may have seen a pattern here. We have, starting out I to the 1, which is I. Then you have I squared, which is negative 1. Then I cubed, which was negative I. Then I to the 4th, which is 1. then I to the 5th, which is I, then I to the 6th, which is -1, I to the 7th, which is -I to the 8th, which is 1. So see, we got a pattern. I, -1, -I, 1. I, -1, -I, 1. So in fact, if it's divisible by 4, you'll get it down to 1. If it's divisible by 3, you'll get it down to -1, -I. Otherwise, if it's even, get the -1. So let's look at some bigger examples. Another way of thinking about this is, let's just get it in terms of I squared. So we could think this is really just I to the 4th 7 times, right? Since it's divisible by 4, I'm expecting it to match up with 1. But let's try it and see. If you forget what that pattern is, the easiest way is think of it as I squared. So if this is divisible by 2, which it is, we can just change that to a 14th power, right? Place I squared with -1. And we get that to the 14th power. -1, even number of times, gives us a +1. So as I guessed, our answer is 1. All right, for part B. Now we can't rewrite this as an I squared, but we can write it as I to the 18th times an I. So we know we're going to have an I in the answer. It's either a -I or a +I. Now let's see what happens. Let's rewrite I to the 18th just like we did the 28th. So we know that's the same as I squared. And we want something that multiplies to give 18, so I'm going to raise it to the 9 power times I. Alright, so that I squared becomes a -1 to the 9th power times I. Well, if you have an odd number of -1s, that stays negative. So this is the same as -1 times I, which is just -I. Okay, part C. We can rewrite this. If you have a negative exponent, you have to move it down to the bottom. So this is 1 over I to the 9th. Now, you can't divide 9 evenly by 2, so I'm going to change this to 1 over I to the 8th times I. So we know we're going to have an I left over. Rewrite I to the 8th. We know I squared. If we raise it to the 4th power, 4 times 2 gives us the 8 times I. Place I squared with -1. And again, if we have an even number of -1s, it's going to make it positive. So this is just 1 over I. Or you could write it as I to the -1. Either one of those would be good answers. All right, that's it for chapter 8.